Something is wrong here. Have they ever been discovered? It sounds like the kind of thing that should have a clear answer. Either they were, or they were not. That is how we usually hold a question like this. We assume that if something was found, there would be a point where the searching ends and the answer stays still. And at first, that feels reasonable. You can sit with that. You can trust it. But then something starts to press against it. Not enough to break it. Just enough that it no longer sits cleanly where it should. The answer seems like it ought to be settled, and yet it does not stay settled for very long. You look at it one way, and it feels obvious. You look again, and that feeling weakens. Not because the question changes. It does not. It remains plain. It remains direct. But what should fit inside that question does not seem to stay in place. So you come back to it again, expecting the same simple ground beneath it. And again, it feels almost simple, almost clear, almost finished. Have they ever been discovered? The question sounds simple enough to file on a label. Have wood fragments of Noah's Ark ever been discovered? In one museum drawer, the answer appears to be no before the envelopes are even open. Several dark splinters lie separated in paper packets, each packet marked with a different mountain name, not one with a chain of custody that begins anywhere near a single known source. The wood is there, but the claim is not. If authentic Ark wood had ever been found, some verified fragment should have settled into the record by now. Instead, there are only disconnected pieces and a much older certainty about location. The Ark belonged by tradition on Ararat. That tradition keeps the mountain in view even when the evidence does not cooperate. A steep slope of snow and blue ice covers the upper ridge with no exposed structure anywhere. No hull line, no beam field, no concentration of debris. At that altitude, absence has weight. Wood left in weather usually does not wait for centuries to be discovered. It splits, rots, powders, or vanishes. On a lab tray nearby, a waterlogged timber demonstrates the ordinary rule. Its surface loosens into fibers under damp conditions, collapsing into a soft fringe beside a dish of soil. That seems to settle the matter. If the Ark had ever existed as wood on a mountain, time should have erased it. Then the corridor painting interferes. Inside a monastery, a pilgrim panel shows black beams jutting from a white glacier wall. The image is not evidence of timber and ice, only evidence that people repeated the same report often enough to paint it. That could still be explained neatly. Pilgrims saw dark bands in snowfields, or rock ledges, or avalanche debris, and devotion supplied the rest. A pious misreading can travel farther than any object. The drawer of splinters begins to look like the residue of that process. Stories first, fragments later. But the physical problem remains awkward. Why do the stories so often specify wood, and not merely a holy place? Why beams and ice, not lights, voices, footprints, or some other devotional sign? The painted timbers are squared, dark, and partially buried. A very particular mistake to repeat across generations if nothing visible ever prompted it. The mountain view answers with blankness again. Snow, blue ice, no structure. That should be enough. Yet, blankness on a glacier is not the same thing as a permanent negative. Ice covers, shifts, releases, and seals. A sighting can be unverified and still be based on something briefly exposed. The drawer of envelopes with its different mountain names starts to look less like proof and more like drifty claims detached from whatever first generated them. Still, no authenticated fragment emerges. The wood in the drawer has no verified origin. The painted panel is late. The slope is empty. The lab sample keeps crumbling on schedule, obeying the normal behavior of timber in wet conditions. If any Ark wood survived, it would have required unusual preservation. And unusual preservation is exactly what the mountain stories insist on, without ever producing a piece that can carry the claim on its own. So the record holds in an uneasy position. No verified wood from Noah's Ark is known. Reported finds remain legend, memory, or misidentification. Yet the question does not disappear, because the stories are not about vague sanctity. They keep returning to the same stubborn image. dark timbers where wood should not still be visible at all. The question sounds simple until the evidence shrinks. No verified timber from Noah's Ark is known, and no excavated hull sits on any ridge. Yet the record does not begin with beams. It begins with pieces too small to build with and too portable to ignore. In one church inventory, a wood chip sits inside a gold reliquary under a lamp, listed not as construction material, but as contact with sacred history. In a monastery cabinet, several splinters occupy velvet compartments, each label naming the ark rather than a mountain, a date, or a donor. That arrangement suggests an answer that almost settles the matter. Perhaps no one ever discovered the vessel itself, but fragments were discovered, divided, and carried away long ago. Medieval descriptions make that seem workable. More than one writer mentions pilgrims receiving tiny slivers from clerics, not planks, not beams, just enough wood to wrap in cloth and take home. A manuscript image preserves the same scale. A kneeling traveler, a cleric, a sliver held between fingers. Small pieces travel. Small pieces survive handling. A whole structure on a remote mountain would be nearly impossible to preserve, but a thumb-length fragment could pass from shrine to shrine for centuries. If the ark had become a sacred source rather than an archaeological object, then discovery would not look like excavation. It would look like distribution. That explanation fits the size of the surviving claims, and even the storage conditions. In one storeroom, a wrapped fragment lies beside larger broken planks of ordinary use. And the contrast is telling. The larger boards are stacked as lumber. The small piece is isolated, wrapped, named. Its value is not structural. It is attributed. But the records that make the fragments plausible also leave a practical gap. The labels are devotional and late. The manuscripts describe receiving relics, not where the relics had been taken from. The reliquaries preserve the claim, not the root. If these were once cut from a known source, why do the cabinets preserve so many names of churches, and so few names of places? The physical behavior of the objects keeps the possibility alive anyway. Wood decays quickly, in ordinary conditions. Transport usually destroys context before it destroys the fragment. A splinter can outlast its story. That would explain why the pieces remain while the source disappears. It would also explain why relic culture favored the smallest units. A sacred vessel, once treated as a reservoir of blessings, would be reduced by devotion itself. Yet the surviving pieces do not gather around one remembered extraction. They appear in separate collections, under separate traditions, often with no shared wording except the ark. If the source had once been famous and accessible enough to supply pilgrims, why did the descriptions dwell on the gift and not the site? And if no site was securely known, what exactly was being divided? So the investigation stalls in a narrow but stubborn space. Have wood fragments of Noah's Ark ever been discovered? Not in any verified sense. But the relic trail is too widespread to dismiss as a single invention, and too detached from a source to count as a discovery in the modern sense. The fragments exist as claimed objects. The vessel behind them does not. Between those two facts, the old slivers keep their hold. Have wood fragments of Noah's Ark ever been discovered? The easiest answer sits in a glass case. A row of dark splinters, each tagged with a shrine name, several with blank spaces where dates or prior owners should be. If discovery means a surviving piece physically exists somewhere, then yes, many pieces have existed. If discovery means a fragment can be followed back, step by step, to one source on one mountain, the labels begin to thin out almost immediately. That first problem seems manageable. Small relics travel badly on paper but well in cloth, boxes, and memory. A splinter can outlast the record of who carried it. So the missing intervals under the glass do not, by themselves, disqualify anything. A fragment could have been cut from a larger sacred timber centuries ago, and simply passed through too many hands to document. For a moment, the case looks less like a warning, and more like what survival would naturally look like. Tiny pieces, detached from a vanished whole. Then the wood itself goes under magnification. In the microscope view, the sample shows ordinary grain, ordinary growth rings, No unusual resin pocket. No worked surface hidden under oxidation. Nothing that points to a singular vessel preserved from deep antiquity. Identification reports on such pieces usually stop at common species categories. Ancient wood, yes, sometimes. Exceptional wood, no. If the Ark relics were genuine, what should they look like besides old wood? That question keeps the ordinary grain from settling the matter. A legendary object made of timber would still be timber. The market evidence presses harder. Box splinters and old wooden crosses hang together beneath icons, all darkened by age and handling. All close enough in size to pass from one devotional setting to another without resistance. Near Eastern sacred commerce had room for substitutes. A revered source could be copied, divided, renamed, or simply approximated. Suddenly, the common grain explains too much. Any old fragment from the right region, or even the right atmosphere, could enter circulation as Ark wood. Yet the pieces from different shrines do not quite cooperate with that easy dismissal. Laid side by side on a white table, they match in color and scale, but not in markings. One has a split edge that suggests long weathering. Another shows a cleaner break. Another carries surface darkening only on one face. If they were all products of one relic workshop, or one wave of pious substitution, why did they refuse to settle into one manufacturing pattern? If they came from one original timber divided repeatedly, why is there no recurring structural feature? No shared tool trace, no distinctive pitch, no consistent species result to pull them back together. The gaps in ownership histories return here in a different form. They do not only hide origins, they also hide divergence. A fragment could have entered a monastery as Ark wood in the 12th century and begun life somewhere entirely unrelated. Another could be much older and still tell nothing about a vessel. The objects are real. The belief attached to them is historically traceable. What remains missing is the one thing the investigation keeps reaching for and not finding. A fragment whose material behavior, documented passage, and physical comparison all point to the same source instead of merely surviving the same story. Have wood fragments of Noah's Ark ever been discovered? At ground level, the answer stays no. On the upper slopes of Ararat, the answer keeps refusing to stay that simple. The reports that keep the question open do not begin with a ship-shaped outline or a complete wall of timber. They begin with exposure. A dark squared beam appears from melting ice high on a volcanic slope, not rounded like driftwood, not splintered like a branch, but angular enough to invite the oldest explanation available. Buried worked wood, preserved where cold and ash sealed it away. That would account for why nothing permanent remains visible. Ice moves. A season opens a face, then closes it. A glacier crack reveals a short line of timbers. The next snowfall erases the gap. If wood survived anywhere on Ararat, it would survive like this, in pockets, briefly visible, then taken back. That explanation gains force from the mountain itself. Ararat is not only cold, it is layered. Ice, ash, rockfall, and wind can isolate material from rot. A preserved wooden piece, half embedded in frozen ash near black outcrops, fits that logic better than any lowland relic ever did. Even the local warning traditions point upward, not outward. Stack stones below a cloud-covered ridge where no trail continues, as if the dangerous zone mattered before modern expeditions began recording coordinates. If repeated accounts place worked wood in the same inaccessible band, then perhaps the old stories were not describing a whole vessel at all, only intermittent exposures of buried remains. But the details that make the reports persuasive also narrow them. A squared beam is useful evidence only if it stays where it was seen long enough to be measured, sampled, and relocated. Many accounts do not get that far. One expedition notes timber emerging from ice at a given elevation. Another reaches the same sector and finds only melt channels and dark, volcanic debris. A line of buried wood seen in a glacier crack sounds stronger than a single beam until the crack closes, and no continuous structure can be traced beyond a few feet. Was the ice exposing one object, several unrelated pieces, or shadows along fracture lines? Preservation raises another difficulty. Wood sealed in frozen ash should show a stable surrounding matrix. Yet some descriptions place the material in clean blue ice, others in dirty snow, others beside loose rock. Those are not the same environments. If glacial movement is carrying old timber downslope, then the wood may be displaced from its original resting place. If it is still in place, why do the reported orientations vary so much? Horizontal in one sketch, upright in another, angled sharply in a third. The mountain keeps offering just enough coherence to hold attention. Worked wood, repeated altitude bands, exposure and reburial, sacred warnings attached to the same upper zone. That almost explains why claims of arc fragments persisted for centuries without a recoverable hull. Then the practical question returns. If real timber has emerged more than once, where is even one beam with a documented chain from ice face to laboratory table? The slope remains under cloud, the shrine remains below the no-trail ridge, and the reported wood remains caught in a pattern that is more substantial than legend and less stable than discovery. Have wood fragments of Noah's Ark ever actually been discovered? On Ararat, the first answer seems to be no, for a very ordinary reason. Beside a ruined mountain shelter, weathered boards lie among rusted cans and bent metal. The wood is gray, split along the grain, and scattered where people clearly once stayed. A mountain with hermits, shelters, military patrols, and climbing camps does not need an ancient ship to explain stray timber. A single loose beam lower on the scree says very little when the slope above has carried down every kind of debris for centuries. That explanation holds up well until the reports are narrowed. Some accounts do not describe random planks near camps. They place dark, shaped wood high in ice, above the zones where shelters usually stand. Yet when the record is laid out, the certainty thins again. Two expedition photographs pinned side by side, both labeled to the same ice field, do not show the same thing. In one image, a dark line projects from the glacier face at a right angle, almost squared. In the other, taken from a slightly different position, the shape is shorter, blunter, and could be rock shadow or melt-stained ice. If a beam was really there, why does its outline drift so much between records? If it was only shadow, why do multiple reports keep insisting on worked wood? The next object seems ready to settle that. A long beam on a lab floor carries fresh saw marks and a clean modern nail hole. That piece cannot have come from a prehistoric vessel sealed in ice. It belongs to a later structure, perhaps a shelter dismantled by weather and gravity. Once that is seen, other mountain timbers begin to look less impressive. Loose wood on Ararat proves only that wood reached Ararat. But the lab beam creates its own problem. Its surfaces are dry and open-grained, with recent tool damage easy to read. The high-altitude descriptions, by contrast, repeatedly mention dark wood emerging directly from ice, sometimes water-darkened, sometimes preserved under frozen crusts. Those are not the same exposure conditions. Modern shelter debris explains the boards near ruins, and perhaps some carried downslope. It does not automatically account for reports fixed to specific ice margins over different years. Then the question becomes narrower and harder. Not whether wood has ever been found on Ararat, but whether any reported piece can be tied to a documented place, date, and recovery chain. Here the trail goes thin. The dramatic sightings are often second-hand, or published long after the climb, or attached to coordinates too vague to revisit. No recovered beam has moved from mountain to archive to laboratory with a record strong enough to survive comparison. The mountain keeps producing stories of timber, but not one specimen that remains the same object all the way through the paperwork. So the answer is split. Wood has certainly been discovered on and around Ararat. That much is easy. What has not been discovered is a fragment that can stay identified as arc wood once location, condition, transport, and later human activity are all placed in the same frame. And yet those photographs remain on the wall, still not matching each other, still not matching the shelter debris below. The question sounds simple enough. Have wood fragments of Noah's Ark ever been discovered? In the cases along the walls, the answer looks like no. The splinters are tiny, separated by church labels, each one too small to carry its own geography. But the room changes the question. Beside them hang photographs of one high ravine on Ararat, and above those photographs are maps from different centuries, each with a circle drawn in nearly the same upper zone. The labels disagree on dates, languages, and routes. The circles keep returning to the same place. That repetition offers a workable explanation. Perhaps the fragments matter less as individual relics than as echoes of a remembered source. If monasteries and pilgrims kept pointing to one mountain sector, then the wood in their reliquaries might preserve not proof, but direction. The old reports become easier to read that way. Not, "Here is the ark," but "Wood came from there." No. The notebooks strengthen that impression. 3 of them, from different expeditions, lie open to sketches made decades apart. Each shows straight members emerging from snow at similar elevations. Not driftwood shapes, not twisted roots, but squared lines, parallel edges, lengths measured against walking staffs and boot prints. One note gives a visible span of just over 2 meters before the ice closed around it. Another marks the timber as dark, worked, and partly embedded in frozen debris. A third places the sighting above the last vegetation line, where random branches would need an explanation of their own. For a moment the pattern holds. Repeated zone, repeated reports, repeated mention of shaped wood. That is enough to make the relic stories feel less like scattered invention and more like distant copies of a single mountain memory. Then the skyline in the photographs starts doing its own work. The ravine the church display is not the boat-shaped ridge that later drew so much attention. That formation sits lower, in brown earth, under the same summit but outside the ice field described in the notebooks. Yet once the ridge entered popular discussion, older accounts were recopied with new confidence, as if one feature explained the other. The geography does not quite permit that convenience. If the relic tradition points upward into ice, why do later summaries keep drifting downslope toward a different landmark? The measurements complicate it further. The sketched beams appear at similar elevations, but the bearings are not identical. One notebook places the exposure on a northeast-facing slope, another in a cleft west of a black outcrop, another near a glacier margin that has since migrated. Ice moves. Ash layers shift. A fixed source could be re-exposed in different years from different angles. That helps. But if one buried structure fed all these reports, why do none of the sketches agree on orientation? A hull-sized body should impose some continuity on the sightings. The relics along the wall return at that point with a different weight. Their labels name monasteries far apart from one another, yet several traditions say the wood came from Ararat, not merely from the east or a holy mountain. That specificity is hard to ignore. So is the scale. A repeated source could explain many small fragments better than one dramatic discovery ever could. But the fragments carry no shared cut pattern, no matching species record, no sequence of custody reaching back to the mountain. So the answer remains caught between 2 kinds of recurrence. The objects recur. The mountain zone recurs. The reports of shaped timber recur. What does not recur is the one thing discovery would require. A continuous piece of evidence that stays the same while the centuries look at it. The question sounds simple enough to label. Have wood fragments of Noah's Ark ever been discovered? In the gallery, the answer appears to be no before any caption is read. The central pedestal is empty. Around the walls, small relics sit in separate cases. A thumb-length splinter under one church name, a darker chip under another. A cluster of narrow fragments gathered beneath a single sheet of glass. The arrangement says what the labels cannot prove. There are objects. There is no accepted object. That emptiness would settle the matter if the fragments themselves were not so persistent-y. They are not modern inventions in the easy sense. Inventories mention them. Pilgrim accounts mention receiving them. Reliquaries were built to hold them. A faded painting in the same room shows black beams jutting from white ice on Ararat, and beside it sits a tiny wood piece in metalwork worn by centuries of handling. So perhaps the full vessel was never found, but small pieces were. That would fit the scale of what survives. Splinters travel, beams do not. Under magnification, though, the wood does not help much. Growth rings, grain direction, common species. Nothing in a sliver of aged timber announces that it once belonged to a singular vessel, rather than a roof, a chest, a shrine door, or any other old object cut and recut across centuries. The labels around the room do not close the gap. Several fragments are similar in size and color, but their ownership trails open late, skip generations, or begin only when a monastery treasury first lists them. If relic traffic moves substitute pieces through sacred markets, then the cases hold a history of belief, not a history of one ship. That explanation sits comfortably until the mountain reappears. On the wall opposite the reliquaries is a photograph of Ararat under moving cloud, the upper slope banded with ice. Reports from different periods place exposed timber not in village churches or lowland shrines, but high on the mountain itself, in the same difficult zone. Some describe squared beams, not driftwood. Some place them emerging briefly from ice or frozen ash, then gone again. A whole structure is absent. Intermittent wood is not. If glacial movement and volcanic deposits can preserve and then uncover buried material, the old relic traditions begin to look less like free-floating legend, and more like repeated memory of a source no one could secure. Yet the mountain keeps introducing ordinary explanations at the exact point where the extraordinary one seems nearest. Ararat has shelters, hermit sites, climbing routes, abandoned camps. Loose boards and worked timbers can belong to later human presence. A beam recovered from a slope may carry saw marks too fresh for antiquity, or a nail hole of the wrong type, or no documented recovery context at all. Even the photographs resist alignment. One image shows a dark line in ice. Another, taken in the same field, shows a different shape at a different angle, as if the mountain keeps offering forms that resemble structure only briefly. So the question narrows and refuses to close. Not whether wood has ever been found on Ararat, and not whether churches ever possess fragments called ark wood. Both happened. The harder question is whether any fragment in those cases and any timber reported on that mountain ever belonged to the same buried source. The empty pedestal remains in the center of the room, but the walls around it are crowded with reasons people kept leaving space for something larger.